We now have Nalika Briganza joining us live. Nalika is the program director at Teach for India. Today, she's going to talk to us about trauma-informed instruction in the time of the pandemic and beyond in her session titled Maslow Before Bloom. Over to you, Nalika.
Thank you so much, Anu. I'm just going to share my screen. Great. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the space on Maslow Before Bloom. I am Nalika. I was a 2012 Teach for India Fellow in Mumbai, and post that, I served on the Mumbai program team working with teachers and students and staff for 6 years. I currently serve as a program director to all of our and I think something else that's really important to mention is that I am not a mental health professional. I am not an expert on trauma. I am not even a psychology student, but I am an educator. I am a teacher, and that makes it important to me, right? I'm also someone who's had quite an interesting journey with mental health and well-being, from being somebody who, as a young adult, would roll my eyes every time someone said well-being, and I'd say, just let's get work done, and high expectations, to being someone who really, really deeply understands the importance and the need for conversations around mental health in the space of education, and being someone who's just spent hours and hours poring over research and reading on this. And so that's something that I'm going to be sharing with you all today. I'm really excited about it because I feel like I get a chance to share everything that I've gone over in these short 15 minutes. I'm going to be going through 3 things. The first is what, a couple of important terms related to trauma-informed instruction. The second is why. Why is it so important for us as educators to know all of this? And third, how may we incorporate some of this through the practices in our classrooms? Let's start off with trauma and toxic stress. There are many definitions available on trauma. I picked the one that I love the best, which is an exceptional experience in which powerful and dangerous events overwhelm a person's capacity to cope. The reason I love this definition so much is because it's not about categorizing events into traumatic or non-traumatic or more traumatic than something else. It's about honoring each person's individual capacity to cope and really stressing on that. Right? The second thing we're going through is toxic stress. Now, before we get into toxic stress, another thing that's important to understand is that stress is important for our children's development. Healthy stress is really, really important. It helps them build resilience. It helps them cope, build confidence. So when a child cries on their first day of school or gets nervous before an exam, that's very, very important for them. However, when stress becomes excessive, chronic, and is to an extent that a child cannot cope, we call that toxic or chronic stress. And this is coupled with the lack of an adult figure to support them through that stress. So it's important to note that stress is important, but toxic stress is harmful. What toxic stress does is it increases the level of cortisol, or the stress hormone, in a child's body. And in the long term, this could increase blood pressure, could increase heart rate. It impacts the digestive functions and immunity of a child, and it impacts the ability of the child to form neural connections in their brain. So it does impact learning. Something that's really important for us to know as educators, the brain of the child. I was in a session organized by Teach for All with this facilitator called Anna Jessamine, and she shared something just really beautiful that stuck with me, and I'd love to share with you today. She shared a very simple way of looking at the brain. So I have 3 parts, and each one of those parts asks a really essential question. The first part of the brain is the brainstem, and that asks the question, am I safe? When that condition is fulfilled, only then can a brain move on to ask the next question, which is, am I accepted and am I loved? And only once these 2 conditions are fulfilled can a child's brain move on to the prefrontal lobe to ask, now what can I learn? So when we think about Maslow before Bloom, initially I used to look at it as a cool slogan, but I came to understand that it was backed by science, and that if as a teacher, I am not able to ensure an environment where my children feel safe, accepted, and loved, there is no way that they are going to learn. when a child feels unsafe. We're going to explore that with a little animation through a concept called the window of tolerance and something that some of you may be aware of, which is the fight, flight, and freeze response. Okay, we're going to call this character Sam. Now, Sam cruises through the day. And as Sam cruises through the day, he stays mostly in the gray zone. Sometimes Sam feels slightly higher energy, right? So for example, right now, because I'm on this call and I'm facilitating the space, my heart is beating a little faster, my hands are a little bit cold, and so that's natural to feel. At some point, Sam also feels lower energy. And this is time when I may not feel that much of emotion, I may feel a little bit low on my energy. But what's important, through the day, Sam is able to think and feel simultaneously, which helps Sam to regulate emotion and stay in the moment. So even though I'm stressed now a little bit and a little bit nervous, I'm able to stay present and facilitate the space, hopefully. So it's important to stay in the space. Now, there are two responses when Sam doesn't feel safe in a space. When Sam feels triggered, one response is that Sam's heart starts beating really rapidly, racing thoughts, jittery. Sometimes I retaliate, right? And so that's called hyperarousal, or the state where I may experience emotions of anger, rage. That's also our fight and flight space. On the other hand, sometimes things may get too overwhelming, right? And I felt this as well, maybe when I'm planning a session that just seems too much, where I feel really, really stressed out and I can't think straight, so I go to sleep. And that's hypoarousal, where I may feel really low energy, I may feel disconnected. And so when Sam's over there, that's called the freeze state. Now, the window of tolerance is really important. The fight, flight, freeze concept is really important. And it's really important for me as an individual to understand when I'm perceiving danger and prepare my body to respond to that danger. What happens with children who experience chronic stress and toxic stress and experiences of trauma is that the window keeps shrinking. And so what happens to them is that they get really easily triggered by different things in their surrounding and they immediately shift to fight, flight, or freeze, to hyper or to hypoarousal. Let's take this with an example. I love providing examples because it makes it more concrete. We're going to look at Lila. So Lila's a kid studying in class. Now, when Lila's studying, suddenly the recess bell rings. Okay, it's the end of recess. She's been studying. The end of recess bell rings. And to Lila, she hears a sound. Now, for most of us, that sound is okay. But for Lila, she has experienced chronic stress in the way that at night, every night, she's experienced her parents arguing and fighting and really loud sounds. And so when she hears the bell ring, to her, she's already hyper vigilant because she feels like there's danger around even when there isn't. Coupled with that, you have kids running around, putting their bags in place. There's so much activity in the classroom. Lila moves from being in her window of outside her window of tolerance. And now she's thinking threat, danger, heart beating fast, feeling stressed, hands are cold. And as a teacher, if I start with the bell has rung, everybody, get together, let's sit down, let's focus, open your books, Lila's not going to be with me. And perhaps many other children in class like Lila may not be with me. So the question is, what can I do as a teacher to bring her back to her window of tolerance so that she can learn effectively? Another study that's actually really, really important to make note of, and if you're interested, you can Google this later, there's a lot of research available, is the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. Now, this was done in the US, where they asked 17,500 people, adults, about certain experiences that they call adverse childhood experiences. Now, these were the ones that they listed down, so 10 experiences. And for every experience that you responded to with a yes, that would be counted as 1 point on your ACE study. They then took this and correlated it with health outcomes. And what they realized was that if people had more than 4 ACEs, they had a higher likelihood to develop smoking habits, higher attempted suicide, higher likelihood of developing depression as adults. Furthermore, when we look at education, the research tells us that children who have no ACEs, so 0 ACEs, their score is 0, 3% of those children display behavior problems and learning disabilities, whereas with children with 4 or more ACEs, that number is 51%, right? 51% of children. Furthermore, what the study shows us is that in communities where the needs are high, where there's poor housing, economic instability, community disruption, and so on, the incidence of ACEs is much higher. And that made me think a lot about the pandemic and the situation that our kids are in and what state they're probably going to come back to school in, or what state they are in right now because of everything that they're facing. Left me with a little bit of lack of hope, but it also left me with a huge feeling of being empowered. And empowered because as teachers, we have such a crucial role towards supporting our children with this. Now I'm going to be sharing 5 principles as teachers, and this is the how, right? So 5 principles that we could adopt as teachers in our classrooms. I'm going to share specific practices, but my request and recommendation is to keep the principles in mind and contextualize it to your own classroom needs. The 5 principles are really important because they combat the impact of adversity. So when a child is going through toxic stress, they feel unsafe, they feel threatened. And what this principle states, how can I create a space where my classroom feels safe for students emotionally, physically? The second and third, when a child is experiencing a traumatic event, they feel like they have no choice, no control, no power. And so, how can our classrooms be designed to give our students choice, to empower them, and to equip them with the skills that they need to navigate through their emotions? The fourth and the fifth, once again, touch upon power, but also predictability. Right? Now, when a child experiences threat, they begin to form a certain understanding of power, saying, I am powerless, another person is in power. And so, as teachers, how can we ensure that power in our classrooms is shared? And with trustworthiness, when things are uncertain for a child, how can we ensure that we build structures for predictability? I'm going to put a couple of practices, and these are really simple, but these aren't as important as the principles themselves. Take 30 seconds to go through this, and then we're going to move to the last section of this space. The last and the most important to me personally is my belief as an educator. What do I believe about my children, myself, and about education? The first, a warm and trusting relationship with an can reverse the damage caused by adversity. So important because we talked about cortisol and the stress hormone, but when trust is formed with an adult, that releases a hormone called oxytocin, and that actually reverses the impact of cortisol in the body. Second, children do well if they can. As a beginning teacher, I remember being so frustrated, being, why does this child do this? Why does that child do that? And I would often think children were doing things intentionally, but a belief to hold is that children do well if they can. And moving from the question, what is wrong with this child, to what has happened to this child. It's very natural as teachers when something happens for us to say, why did this child do this? What's wrong with them? And that's natural and that's okay. No need to beat ourselves up about it. Then we move one step further gradually to say, what is the cause of this child's behavior? What's happened that has made this child react this way? And how can we support the child to behave in a manner that is acceptable, because children do well if they can. That's all for today. I'm going to put a couple of things that I found really helpful. My hope is that the short 15 minutes has sparked some curiosity in you to go and look over these things. You'll find a lot of really interesting practice and much deeper theory there. So that's all from my end. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining.